In the beginning there was God or dog, me the creator, me the almighty, master of the universe. For many long millennia, I resided alone in the heavenly sphere of stars and darkness and black holes and space, until one day, after 15 billion years, I realized that I was bored. Indeed, how could I not be? For ever I won my endless games of solitaire, slapping down cards on the overturned Trinitron box I used as my card table. Heaven is such a terrible drag, I thought, as I flipped a card from my deck and slapped down the 7 of God or dogs. I sighed. It was just the card I needed to win the game, again. So I shuffled the deck, dealt another hand, and flipped a card face up to start the next round. That card was the Jack of Asses. I had created 4 universal suits: God or dogs, winds, decks of cards, and asses, just because I found that amusing. The suits were named in order of creation, with myself being eldest, followed by the things that I had created: winds, decks of cards, and my ass, which I had created to sit upon and play solitaire to counter my boredom. I looked down at the Jack of Asses, and suddenly it was caught in the winds of rising and change, and was torn free from my hand. The Jack fluttered peacefully through the air, floating, before landing under the edge of my Trinitron box, and I was amused. I clapped my hands gaily and let out a yelp of joy that was never heard, the concept of sound having not yet been created. Most amusing, I thought, is the spontaneity of the winds to carry the Jack of Asses so. There were, of course, 17 great winds: change, gale, sneeze, hiccup, time, stretch, space, hurricane, snort, kiss, virulence, matter, sweetness, heat, rising, falling, and red. Just then, I felt very selfish. I desired mental stimulation, someone to talk to, and I had a sudden whim. I picked up the Jack of Asses and looked at it, fluttering in the winds of hiccup and stretch, and I smiled. I smiled at the spontaneity of the winds, even though I, master of the universe, controlled all the actions of the winds, as they acted where they pleased, when they pleased, for my pleasure, by my will alone. This contradiction amused me as well, and I'd spent many long eternities in mental masturbation, contemplating the spontaneity of the winds, which I controlled fully. But I felt my mind drifting, and decided to focus for now on the present, though the concept of time was but a wind. I looked down at the Jack of Asses and thought aloud, if I had someone to talk with, then perhaps heaven wouldn't be such a terrible drag. And for a moment, the thought of speaking with the Jack of Asses greatly amused me, so I began to tear the Jack of Asses out of the paper card. The edges tore crudely at first, then melded into perfect lines. All that remained now was the figure of the Jack of Asses, which looked quite a bit like my behind. How amusing, I thought, though it wasn't really amusing, since it was the reason I'd named the suit Asses. But as I looked down at the Jack of Asses, so similar to my own, it was almost as though the Jack were speaking to me, almost as though my ass were speaking to me, standing erect and tall and proud, speaking with its own voice, by its own will, by my will alone, and I was greatly amused by the Jack of Asses' speech. So I mused on, would it not be splendid were I to create a new Jack of Asses that was its own deck of cards and could reproduce more decks of cards on its own? These Jacks of Asses, then, might eternally amuse me, for would they not be affected by the same winds that amuse me so? Yes, I knew, of course, was the answer. So I created a plantation where everything would be provided for my Jacks of Asses. I created 123,456 of them, and they awoke on the plantation to a new dawn and found milk and honey and bread before them. All was there that the Jacks of Asses needed, and they grew happy and content. I watched as the winds blew over them, and the Jacks of Asses saw envy in each other's eyes, and envied their brothers in return. The small cadre of Jacks of Asses fought amongst themselves, made dirty jokes, and ate all of the food I had provided for them. Then they fought amongst themselves some more, made dirtier jokes, and ate the stale remnants of their food. After which they fought amongst themselves even more, made cruder jokes, and ate their own feces. The Jacks of Asses' numbers diminished until they disappeared completely, and I was most displeased, for it was clear that I had done what I called a fuck-up, and the creator of the universe didn't like fuck-ups. So I called then upon the great winds once more, willing them to act of their own will by my will alone. The wind of sneeze blew 1,000,000 floating kernels into the heavenly ether, kernels that wafted fancifully down, and in that instant I thought a thought, and pop! the kernels popped. I held out my left hand like a great bowl and gathered 1,000,000 popped kernels therein, then sat in popcorn meditation, contemplating my fuck-up. After many long millennia, I smiled. I had it. With a snap, I created the concepts of male, female, and the orgasm to ensure propagation of the species. How did I not see it before, I wondered, and yet I knew the answer at once. How could the jacks of asses procreate and create their own decks of cards without a means to do so? I shook my head. How frightfully silly of me. Then I created a new habitation and planted another cadre of jacks of asses, both male and female. But I noticed right away that the jacks of asses envied each other even more. I was about to intervene and end the experiment, thinking I'd done another fuck-up, when I saw that while the jacks of asses envied each other more, they also loved each other more. The orgasm had paid off, I knew, and I was pleased. I watched as the jacks of asses propagated and spread throughout the lands. I waited patiently for a righteous and pious jack of asses to die and come up to heaven to speak with me. But a curious thing happened, I realized, though I hadn't planned it, which meant that I had planned it fully, of course. Not a single jack of asses ever made it to heaven. Every single one was barred from the gates of light. I immediately discerned the reason why, the reason that I already knew. The great wind of red, on its own counsel by my will alone, had closed the gates of light to the jacks of asses, closed those gates leading to the promised land, to that ocean of white darkness where kernels floated freely through the air, and a single cardboard box sat overturned, myself slouched behind it. I knew, but did not want to admit, that I couldn't have just any companion in heaven. I needed someone I could talk to, someone worthwhile who cared. But none ever came. I had done another fuck-up. Or had I wondered, already knowing the answer, knowing my great plan, my great design, and I sniggered like a child. For it was then that I created the alternative holy card for my deck of cards. A card, a being, that was at once an ass, a god or dog, a deck of cards, and a wind. This card was my son, my one and only true son, with utterly free will by my will alone, and I knew that I must send my son out amongst the jacks of asses, to guide them from their plantation unto heaven, lest they veer once more from the righteous path. And the most brilliant stroke, I knew, was that the alternative holy card, being a card after all, could be reshuffled and redealt as many times as I needed to get the message across to the jacks of asses. It was brilliant! But first, before sending the alternative holy card out amongst the jacks of asses, I rejoiced, for I finally had someone to talk to.